Now, our second panel, expanding public-private partnership model to new and existing market, is sponsored by Almar Water Solutions, will be co-moderated by Mr. Chiba Seijiro and Mrs. Arantxa Mejia, sorry. Since 2018, Mrs. Seijiro has held the position of General Manager of the Environment Infrastructure Department of Marubeni Corporation at the Tokyo head office, and Mrs. Mencia is currently the Director of Global Business Development at Almar Water Solutions and has over 15 years experience in the global water sector. Thank you and good luck in the panel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, in which we will discuss how to expand the PPP model to new and also existing markets.
As we have limited time, if you don't mind, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves, just with a brief explanation of your background so the audience can understand your different roles in the PPP sector. So, Mr. Rami, please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rami Dandoor. I run Mojito Utilities. Mojito Utilities is the project development arm of the Mojito Group, where we have been developing water, wastewater, and most recently renewable assets across emerging markets.
Good morning, I'm Richard Harris. I'm a partner from Cliff Chance. I've been out here for 16 years in the region. I head the energy and infrastructure team in the Middle East. In that time, I've worked on a number of first projects here, including WEC's first IWPP, DEWA's first IPP, first IWPP in Kuwait. I've also drafted legislation for PPP, including Dubai, the IWPP law, and advised the government of Saudi on its privatization program as well.
Good morning, my name is Frédéric Clos. I work for ENGIE. I'm in charge of the power generation portfolio of ENGIE in the Middle East. We of course produce power, but we also produce water. Half of our plants produce desalinated water, so roughly 5 million cubic meter a day, so enough to feed about 20 plus million people on a daily basis.
I'm Shahid Ali from a company called Nedbank Limited in South Africa. I represent the team called the Infrastructure and Public Financing Infrastructure and Public Financing team, and we specialize in project financing structures. So we've done many PPP projects in South Africa, and we funded projects in various Africa as well.
Thank you. And let me introduce my co-moderator, Arantxa Mejia. It was already announced, but she has a process engineering background, and ever since 2001, she is in the business development part.
Mr. Seijiro Shiba, Mr. Shiba-san, he's the head of water of Marubeni, has been working over 2 decades in the power sector, and also in the last 6 years in the water sector, from an EPC and IWP, PPP, and concession background. And I have to say that I have had the pleasure of working with him for the last year and a half, and I have the opportunity to share his wide knowledge on the subject.
Thank you. Now, let us move to our session. What our panelists have today in common is that, of course, they're leaders, but not only that, they have pioneered in their respective fields in building up this PPP model where it is today. So I think I would like to start with asking their successful experience in breaking through to where they are. Of course, before the success, there must have been challenges. So if you can point out what those challenges were, perhaps one, because we only have an hour here. And also, how you made the breakthrough for those challenges. Can I start? I'll go in sequence, so I'll ask Rami first.
Thank you, Chiba-san. So I'll take you through a little bit of a journey of some selected projects that Mojito has developed and what made them a success. So if I just start in history, we're blessed to have developed the first wastewater BOT in the GCC, which is just here in Dubai Investment Park, back in 1999. And also the same year, the first desalination concession in the Middle East, which is in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Both those were pioneering in those times because they were so early on. And what was the recipe to their success was the phased approach. Even though we had offtake agreements, we never wanted to be in a situation where our clients were exposed to paying for something that they were not going to utilize. And so those projects were built phase by phase, started small and ramped up with the demand. Not necessarily the most cost-effective way to do a big plant, but it is a way to manage the demand risk, which I think is always crucial. Moving forward, more recent times, we developed the first bulk water supply PPP project in sub-Saharan Africa. That's in Kigali, Rwanda. And that was a tremendous experience, not without its hiccups along the way, because it was a learning curve. For the government of Rwanda, it was something new for them, getting everybody on board, getting alignment between all the different stakeholders to ensure, for example, the Ministry of Finance was comfortable giving the kind of guarantees that were required, notwithstanding the pressures on the other side that they were receiving from the IMF, meant that it was a process. The good thing that they did was they had set up the Rwanda Development Board, which is a very progressive organization, to facilitate dealing with all of the different government entities. And they hired a strong set of advisors, in that case led by the IFC, in order to structure the project into a bankable manner. And so I think, to me, that was the reason for that one to succeed. Continuing in that journey, we have developed the first wastewater independent sewage treatment plant in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, signed earlier this year in Dammam, part of their large privatization program. And there I see the secret to the success has been the vision that led by MBS and throughout the leadership in the kingdom, through the ministry, through the SWPC as it's now called, in terms of having a program and having that continuity. Speaking of programs, the one example that I do want to give, which I think is something which is a lesson learned for everybody, this will be my last example, is our experience in China. We entered the Chinese market in 2008, and we developed a portfolio of 11 wastewater projects, 8 municipal, 3 industrial. We're the largest non-Chinese investor into the Chinese wastewater sector. And what made that successful, and the fact that we're able to have so many projects, ourselves and others, was the fact that it was effectively commoditized. And apologies to my friends, the lawyers, where we minimize their work by standardizing what the agreements were, and rolling them out to the point that each bid process took 1 month, compared to, let's say, a year in GCC countries compared to 4 years in African countries for the same projects to take off. And it's the speed and the efficiency that took out the transaction cost, reduced the bidding cost in order to make these projects possible. And that is what I encourage people to do, is to standardize and to make things more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Can we move on to Richard?
Okay, thank you, Chiba-san. And I think just to firstly touch on one of the things you said, Chiba-san, get this one out of the way, challenges. The challenge we faced when we did the first IWPP in the Kingdom, the first IPP in Dubai, in fact, it's the same challenge we face doing any PPP in the region. It's always one of, and I'll be very succinct here, convincing governments what the partnership part of a PPP means. And understanding that an optimal PPP is not about loading risk onto developers, loading risk onto lenders. It's having to accept the risk allocation has to be fair and balanced. And that's a challenge we had on day one. It's a challenge when we advise procurers even today. It's exactly the same discussion we have. Even experienced procurers who've got a well-established model, to your sort of commoditization point, Rami, still want to push the envelope. And as an advisor, when I'm on the government side, part of the challenge is saying, yeah, you can push the envelope, you can push it further onto the developers, but it will come back to bite you at some point. And so once you've settled an optimal risk allocation, be happy with it, get it to the market, and you'll see a lot more market appetite, which will result ultimately in better pricing. So that's really the key challenge we've faced for the last 20 years in developing these projects. I think what our firm's done in the last 20 years in the Middle East in developing PPP has really been hallmarked by innovation. And there's two components to that. The first one is helping to devise what I call facilitating legislation. And secondly, helping to devise well-balanced model contracts which form the basis for these programs. So in terms of facilitating legislation, when Oman started doing IWPs back in the late 90s, there was no legislation. They were the first to put in place proper PPP implementing legislation in 2004. And other countries around the region were still progressing with PPPs without any legislation. And that's not a bad thing. Right? You don't, for the most part, there's very few countries where you need legislation to implement a PPP. But what you can do is pass legislation which facilitates a PPP. So when we did the first IPP in Dubai, one of the functions we had was to develop the IWPP law. And so the philosophy we took to that was to look at the legislative framework and the regulatory framework and say what in this framework is an obstacle or impediment to doing an efficient and well-balanced PPP, and then implement a law which removed those obstacles. The ultimate goal then was to create a sort of a blank canvas on which the procurer could build whatever PPP model it wants. And the goal at the end of it, to Rami's point again, is to ultimately end up with a standardized set of contracts. And I don't think there's any regional procurer that's yet settled on a proper standardized contract. And by standardized, I literally mean you don't amend it unless there's a technical reason for it. Because, and that's frankly the fault of the procurers, because they're the ones always pushing. You know, we've seen multiple projects, exactly the same program for exactly the same asset, tendered months apart, and there's still changes to the risk allocation. And that's frustrating for bidders, lenders. I love it, because it keeps me busy. The second part of it is in terms of model contracts. And again, I come back to establishing a balanced risk allocation. It allows bidders to focus on what they should be focusing on, which is optimizing the tariff and innovating technical solutions. So we advised in the very first PPP projects for DEWA and WEC, as I said. And these are good models, or good examples, should I say, of models that haven't changed a lot over time. They've stayed pretty standard over the last sort of 15 years in WEC's case. And I think that's a number of projects that have been tendered using those documents as a base is testament to the fact the risk allocation is about right. But again, even recently, even this year, we've seen risk allocation change again. And so as much as I probably am not doing myself any favors, and I support Rami in this, that's not the right way to go for procurers. And I think you're actually impeding the effectiveness of PPP in the region if you keep shifting the goalposts on every project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Richard. Frederick?
Well, I think your first question was about successes, right? So I think ENGIE has been very successful in the Middle East in developing, a massive portfolio of infrastructure assets producing power and water. Today we operate 26 power plants across the GCC. We started in 25 years ago with the first IPP in Oman. It was Mana at that time. All those projects, the 26 we operate, have been developed under IPP, IWPP schemes. And today, we operate more than 30 gigawatt of power. As I said, we produce 5 million cubic meters a day of water. So it's a massive portfolio. All this has been developed under IPP, IWPP schemes, and this is really the key success ingredient, I think. And this is a success not only of us, other developers, of course, but mainly a success of this region who have managed to develop this successful IPP, IWPP scheme. In terms of challenge, of course, and I think it was mentioned yesterday, we see, for new projects, a very fierce competition. So this is a key challenge for us, like many other developers, of course. We see also, somebody mentioned that decoupling between power and water.
This is linked to auto being a more successful technology, more efficient technology, cheaper technology now for producing water. And we see a massive pipe of standalone desalination, reverse osmosis plant coming in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in other places across the region. So, bright future. So that's, and in terms of breakthrough, because I think, I remember, 10 or 15 years ago, we're dreaming about producing desalinated water for a cost of less than $1 per cubic meter. And I think today, of course, on a large-scale projects, we are at $0.5. And I think this is a major breakthrough. The water is more affordable, and it's good for everybody.
Thank you, Frederick. Shahid?
Thank you. I guess I can add a bit of the African flavor. So the East Life beyond GCC countries. PPP model in Africa, it does exist. It's been very successful in different parts of Africa. I'm going to start with my home country, South Africa. We've got a very mature market in the PPP market, and it has been applied across different sectors, so roads, rail, sport, as well as water. So in terms of the model, we also have an Africa mandate, so we have funded projects on the PPP basis in Africa, the rest of Africa as well. In particular, there's a desal plant in Ghana at the moment that we funded as well. So in terms of the model itself, it does exist, it works well. For the governments, I'm a bit disappointed I don't see too many government representatives, but it's a fantastic model for governments. And to pick up on the previous topic around more with less, governments are always constrained to budgets. So you've got competing interests, education, healthcare. PPP model is a fantastic opportunity to actually fund big-scale projects with transferring risk to the private sector, allowing the banks to provide the debt, and the sponsors and developers coming with some equity. Perfect model, long-term, absolutely, we think it's an absolute success from what we've seen so far, and there's a lot more opportunity in that. The challenges, constraints, what we want to see, and as bankers, is regulatory certainty. So we're a bit hesitant to put funding into a project if we're not sure how we're going to get repaid. And that, again, I say it's a challenge, but it's not something that you can't overcome. It's the way you structure it. My colleagues mentioned bankability on the other side, advisors. One of my colleagues mentioned advisors and trying to commoditize as far as possible. So all those elements feed into what we expect from the government side of it. Regulatory certainty is the biggest thing for us, making sure that you can structure it where it gives certainty to both the developers but also the banks. So money is not actually the issue. The banks will always provide the funding, whether it's commercial banks or whether it's DFIs. You will always have that available. So the challenge for us is that getting more governments to buy into a PPP model. We have seen some movement in countries like Kenya. You had a speaker from Kenya, the previous panel, and they are thinking along those lines. They already have a program in place, and we hope to see a lot more of that in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shahid.
If you allow me to pick your last word, the future, that will be the question for all of you. How do you see the future? We are talking about maybe new geographies, China, India, Africa, or new business model, new contractual schemes, or maybe new technologies. And what the industry needs is innovation and R&D to evolve. What do you think, Sahid, if you don't mind to start there?
Sure. So I think the great thing about being at an event like this also is you get to see a lot of technology around, lots of companies, lots of new technology, solutions, absolutely. So less concerned about that because we know it's there and it'll also be developed. Previous panel also mentioned looking at reducing costs on the desalination costs. So all of that positive, and we see that going to the future, absolutely. In terms of where we head, and again, I'm going to come back a little bit to Africa. The model, if you look at Africa, the need is absolutely there. The resources are a bit constrained, so both in terms of in terms of water, absolutely, but also in terms of financial constraints. So the future must be that you look at a partnership, and I'm going to pick up on the commoditizing of the different agreements as well. So it's about a partnership. So we do say public-private partnership, absolutely. And we see that future there. The future lies in making sure that each of the partners, each of the different role players come together and contribute whatever they can. Lawyers are always there. The EPC side, very important as well, but also being a bit more inclusive. So what we've seen also is a lot of the technology exists, a lot of the developers available throughout the world, different parts of the world. But coming into Africa, you've got to have a local participation as well. So what we see as a future as well is that local participation as well. So coming into Africa with a view that you're looking to contribute to the local economies as well. So for us, the future is more than just coming in and providing technology, and financing is always there. It's a holistic view in terms of what you actually provide and what you leave, the legacy that you leave in the country. And obviously, there's a profit element, absolutely, and that will come as well. The opportunities are there, and all of that will follow with it.
Frederick, have you got something to say?
Well, okay, so in terms of new markets, I mentioned already decoupling, which for us is a major trend that we're going to follow. We are not a pure water player. We are mainly a power operator or power player. We happen to be in the water sector a little bit by accident, because in the past, everything was coupled. So you produce with cogeneration, you produce steam, and with the steam, you produce water through thermal technology. So we are not doing distribution, water distribution. We are not doing wastewater treatment. But there is one thing that we are looking with a lot of interest, is this new megacities concept that we see emerging in Saudi Arabia. The Red Sea project, the NEOM project, and a few others. I will not name them all, but it's not the traditional IPP or IWPP model. It's more like a concession model. It's a multi-utility concession where we are asked to provide water, cooling, wastewater treatment, power, of course. And so we are looking at all these projects with great interest. And of course, we team up with people who can provide the cooling, which is something we don't do, people who can provide wastewater services, which we don't do, etc. So, but I think this is something really challenging, demanding. It's a multi-utility concession. So it will probably take some time until it's fully established, but quite interesting, and we are actively working on that.
Thank you.
I mean, as a law firm, we tend to follow our clients in terms of jurisdictions. We tend to follow our clients wherever they may go. So obviously all the panelists up here now have my business card, so call me. But touching actually on what you said, Frederick, I mean, that's, to me, the more interesting thing that we're doing at the moment. It's a new model that's being developed in the kingdom, and these gigacities, as they're called. And we're advising on a number of those at the moment, so I'm sort of on the other side from where Frederick hopes to be. And so we're putting together these utility concessions, and it's a very different paradigm from what we're used to seeing in terms of single asset generation or water production or wastewater treatment assets that have been done in the past. These are multi-utility packages covering water, wastewater, district cooling, power, solid waste as well. And for each of those utilities, there's actually multiple assets as well. So it's not a single RO plant. There might be more than one RO plant within that concession. And then you add to it the transmission and distribution component to it, which is quite unique as far as what we've seen in the region. Then it becomes a very different type of project. You move from a traditional availability type model that you see, for example, in a standard IWP, into a deliverability model. And what I mean by that is, in a traditional IWP, as an offtake, you care about, is the plant available to be dispatched at its capacity at any given moment in time? In a deliverability model, I want to know that when I turn the tap, water comes out. It's a very different way of evaluating the performance of the company. Now, having said that, the addition of the T&D, whilst adding a lot of complexity and challenges to the bidders. It offers a lot of new opportunities because A, there's not a lot that can do all of this themselves, so there's a lot of partnering opportunities. Because it's unique, because it hasn't been done before, it requires innovation. And there's a lot of scope to innovate here to distinguish yourselves from your competitors, which also goes to margin. This is not a standard commoditized project. Commoditized projects have what driven the margins down. And by that, I don't mean standardized, I mean commoditized. And the distinction is, commoditized is doing the same IWP over and over again. Standardized is the contracts which are the same. Commoditization has driven the price down. Standardization, I'm sure we'll come back to many times today. But this new gigacity approach and the new models offers a lot of opportunity to find sort of enhanced margins in a region which really has seen margins going south at a pretty rapid rate over the last few years. So I think it's quite an exciting prospect for bidders and lenders, and obviously for us as well.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Richard, for that. And I think it does to build on a little bit on what you're saying on the mega cities that are coming up. From my point of view, I think the model is a very exciting one, and one that we're very keen to put the different parts of the puzzle together to make it all work out. The one word of caution I do pass on to any mega city authority is to really think about the demand risk. Because what we've seen is some of these mega cities come with very grand plans, and then the delivery in terms of occupancy, population growth, etc., is not quite there. And so I do, going back to one of the points I made earlier, I do strongly recommend a much more phased approach. No matter what on paper off-take guarantees there are, it's important that the physical infrastructure built is not overbuilt, even if it's legally protected. Having said that, the model is exciting because of the fact that you're integrating so many different parts into it. So for us as Metito, where are we growing? I think one aspect is going down the value chain. So our history has been the plant, the desal plant, the wastewater plant, etc. Going into the distribution, billing, collection is an area which is relatively novel in this part of the world, not in others, and something where we see a huge opportunity. The other area that we see a lot of opportunity and we're very excited about is the changes that are taking place in the power sector, and particularly in the renewable sector, which is enabling, given the costs of solar going down, it's enabling the cost of desal to also come down. We started with 2 projects in Saudi, desal projects, one in King Abdullah Economic City and one in Neom, where we built a small solar park at each location to accompany the desal, and both have been tremendous successes. From that, we've actually expanded Metito Utilities into the renewable sector in its own right. We've now secured the first publicly bid solar concession in Bangladesh, for example, a 55 megawatt. But we see a future going into combining the power and the water together to come up with a more efficient long-term solution. The last point about growth, Arantxa, going back to your earlier question of new markets, yes, definitely for us as Metito, we are at the frontier of the markets of the world. We are very excited by the less traditional places. So I've mentioned some examples in Africa, in Asia, and we look forward to continue to grow there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been hearing standardization and commoditizing, and which is perhaps a personal request as well, but leaving, because everybody in this world is talking about optimization, and I think we are getting highly competitive among each other, competing bid after bid. Yes, it is a true dream for the last 2-3 decades about standardization, but you gave us I guess a good answer for that, but I still would like to continue to request legal advisors to.
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, I'm going to do myself out of a job here, I suspect, but I am a big proponent of standardization. When I was saying earlier that one of the things I've done over the last few years is advise the government of Qatar and Saudi Arabia on the development of their PPP framework and strategy. And one of the cornerstones of that is standardization, but one of the cautionary tales is You can't go from zero to standardization in a piece of legislation. It has to be an iterative process. Now, a lot of the jurisdictions in the GCC have been through those iterations. The model is well established. It's time to lock it down. It's not time to keep changing it. And we've seen, and I will call out, say, the recent Saudi projects where they've started to put in a cap on your return on termination. That was never there in the first 12, 13 years of Saudi projects. And that's something everyone struggles to accept. And it causes consternation and difficulty when putting your bid together, and you're loading more risk onto the bidders, and it's difficult for everyone. And then at the same time, you've got procurers saying, I don't want any more government support. I don't want to put government balance sheet behind these projects. So the Repto projects don't have a government guarantee. The Saudi schools projects don't have a government guarantee. Yet at the same time, you're pushing more risk onto the bidders. And Frederick and I was saying earlier, it'll only take one project to fail. And we've already seen arbitrations, we've seen disputes on these projects. If one project fails, the pendulum will swing so far back the other way in terms of risk allocation, the procurers will be regretting that fact. So you're better off striking a right balance now, sticking to it, and not keep moving and trying to optimize, but let the bidders focus on what's important. When I advised the governments on that standardization process, I said, give DEWA as an example. We started the DEWA project. We put together what we thought was a very balanced IPP, or PPA, should I say. And over time, it's evolved. That's fine. At some point, everyone's happy with it. Then you can start locking it down just for the power sector. But what you can't do, and there's certainly some legislation, I won't name names here around the region, where the legislation tries to prescribe on day one, never having done a PPP, how to do every sort of PPP in every sort of sector in one piece of legislation. And that does not work. It cannot work. And when we tried to do a project in that context, it was very, very difficult to get away. And we ended up having to change the legislation. So I'm all for standardization. I think there are a number of markets here where you could standardize today. There are a couple that are not ready for it. But for the most part, it is definitely possible. And I'll tell you, as a legal advisor, we face as much pressure as you guys. You want to keep your fees down. You want us to keep our fees down. And we'd like to do that, but then every time we get the document, we think it'll be the same as last time. It's completely different. It's very frustrating for us as well. So I support, unfortunately, for my own job, I support what you're trying to do. But I'm not sure that we'll keep pressing procurers to do so, but let's hope. Fingers crossed.
Okay, before getting into further and deeper conflict of interest with Richard, I want to move on to our next question, which would be, except for the standardization, I know everybody has this place where they think, how can we make better, improve the PPP model in your respective fields? Can I start from Shahid?
Sure. So I think, again, just slightly different flavor when you speak, coming to Africa. PPP model works, but the risk profile is also slightly different. So the expectation from all parties, whether it's sponsor bankers, is different as well. So I'm just picking up one or two comments made in terms of, I'm going to pick up on the guarantee as well. So ideally, you want to stay away from guarantees, but Africa is a different space as well. Your projects are costed in dollars. Your revenue flows are not necessarily in dollars. In fact, most of the time they're not. So you've got to factor that in as well and see how you can work around that. And there is a way to do this, and there is a way to structure around that as well. But again, then it becomes important that you look at a bit of a guarantee structure. In terms of, so those are kind of, I want to leave that as one issue that you've got to consider when you're looking at PPPs in Africa. That is an important element. They work with the way, I think it's more about rolling them up a bit more in the different jurisdictions, but also taking a slightly different approach. In South Africa, it's worked very well. It's a very mature market, as I said previously. The rest of Africa, we're still getting to the point where a lot more of the countries are buying into the PPP concept. So it's a different approach. It may be that for now we may not be a bit standardized when we look at the rest of Africa's in terms of rolling out the projects, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that it's taking through the different jurisdictions in terms of what PPP entails, what the risk profile is, and how it benefits the government, how it benefits the broader economy as well. So it's a slightly different approach, and we think from that perspective, different approach in Africa, but again, very promising, and we expect this to roll out a bit more in different jurisdictions.
Thank you. Frederick?
Yep. Well, I think the first thing is the sustainability of the model. So IPP, IWPP model or schemes are well established, well known in this region. And this, of course, gives confidence to all stakeholders, the investors, the lenders, etc. So we should be careful of maintaining this confidence. And when I mentioned, fierce competition earlier, we see sometimes that the risk allocations are a bit stretched. We see returns are a bit stretched. And there will be a point where we might lose the confidence of both investors and lenders. So we need to be careful to keep a sustainable framework. That would be really my key message.
Thank you, Frederick.
I won't repeat myself with respect to standardization, but I think there's probably one link point, which is recognizing more on the procurer side that this needs to be a partnership. I said this earlier, it's a 25-year potential relationship. You want to roll out a program that's successful, you do that by balancing risk appropriately. And every time we see, I'll give you an example, Kuwait a few years ago on Azanoth 2 tried to put a 10% haircut on the debt on termination. Not been done in the region before. Ultimately, that project didn't proceed. But that sort of pushing the envelope a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And it has a negative impact, I think, on the appetite of the market for those sorts of projects. So I would caution procurers from trying to push too hard because, as I said, when things go wrong, it's going to really destroy the market in that jurisdiction. The second thing is debottlenecking of capacity. It's great to have a centralized PPP function in the government to ensure consistency, particularly as you move PPP outside of power, water, social infrastructure, etc. But you need to have the capacity within that unit to make sure it doesn't become a bottleneck. That doesn't have to be internal capacity, that can be external. You can go out and hire loads of advisors who can help you do things, but if every road must go through Rome, then eventually it's going to get a bit congested. And that slows the process up, and that's not as good, equally not good for developers, but it's certainly not good for the governments who are trying to do things quickly and off balance sheet. But if PPP is seen as a slow way of procuring a project, then governments reluctantly head back towards EPC and other forms of procurement, which is not in sort of our collective best interests.
Thank you. Rami?
I was going to shift the conversation a little bit, probably more relevant to outer region, closer to some of the points that Shahid was making in Africa, but equally in Africa and in Asia, is that, well, actually, as Richard said, this is about a partnership. This is about the long-term viability of these projects. And what sometimes we see is quite a bunch of projects that are 25, 30-year projects on paper, but they're not long-term sustainable. And for us, one of the most important things is to try to figure out how is this project going to benefit all the different stakeholders over that 25, 30-year period. One major issue, especially in water, which is what makes water so much more difficult than power, is the affordability and, in particular, the tariff. So I think the example given in the previous panel by the honorary chairman of PUB, where in Singapore their model is to charge the customers a fair tariff, and instead of subsidies, any support for the poor is done outside of the utility. I think it's something which is very important to be able to get that affordability in order to make the projects viable. And that's something which we're seeing a lot of issue with in a lot of be it African or Asian countries.
I think if we have time, we would like to listen to the audience a little bit. We have like 10 minutes more or less, or 7 minutes for questions. So, yes, have we got a microphone, please? Yeah, there it is.
Sorry, my name is Ajay from Basics. I was desperate actually to intervene a bit earlier because I think the My problem with the IWPPs is really basic, and nobody has really sorted it out up to now. Once you start with an IWPP, you lock the project, the client, and everybody in a sort of technology, which by the next 2-3 years afterwards, it becomes, in some places, obsolete. Is that a fair way of continuing? Unless we have a process where we can allow for the IWPP to be renegotiated, restructured, we are really not doing our clients any service. That's one thing. The other thing, we are also, and that's from experience, which I've seen here over the last 20 years, we're saddling governments with responsibilities which they are unable to keep continuously. We're taking the easy way out, looking for off-takers, and the real thing is what Rami has suggested. We have to go down the line and be responsible for the collection, obviously with some guarantees in place, but we can do even the collection a lot better than governments. So I think what we are doing, and especially with the case of Suez, if you don't permit me to say so, it's not viable, really. It's not a great service when you just deal with the government and oblige them to sit with a responsibility for 20 years. I would like to have your comments on this. Thank you.
Hi. Richard, have you seen any contract where that is allowed? Or?
No, and it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there's three key stakeholders in an IWPP. One is the procurer or off-taker, one is the developer. The third one, which is really critical, are the lenders. And I'm just playing this through in my mind, if I was to bake into a PWPA an obligation or a right to enhance or do variation work on the project, say 10, 12 years, whatever it might be, into the project to install a new technology, as a procurer, I might say that's a fantastic idea. If you can do that, I'm all for it. Anything's more efficient, that's good for me, it's good for you. And I'm going to blame you now, Shahid, but you've got the bank sitting over their shoulder saying, no, it's not broke, don't fix it. I'm still getting paid, I want to get paid, I don't want to do anything to the plant that may jeopardize my ability to get repaid. If you took the lenders out of the equation, then you've probably got more likelihood of having that sort of approach, because the sponsors can take an educated risk based on equity risk, and procurers are all for anything that optimizes the provision of the service. I think the problem, I hate to say this as I think it out loud, is probably the fact that the lenders are risk averse, and that's probably the nub of it. Sorry,
Perhaps,
Shahid.
Can I add to that? So,
Lenders are there.
I thought you might.
I think it's more about certainty. So you look at the funding required in most of the project. The numbers are quite high. So you model it on a particular tenor, and that becomes important. So when you look at the repayment profile, it's based on a certain return at a particular tariff rate, and that's how the banks are prepared to fund it. The minute you take away that certainty, I'm not saying it's not possible, but you've got to have something that will replace that. So if you're saying we want to renegotiate, it must be that there's an exit for the bank at that point in time, or it is on terms that actually work for the bank. And that becomes a bit more tricky. And these are long-term projects. So you're not looking at a 3 to 5 year play, you're looking at the 10 years. In terms of technology, absolutely, it's a valid point. Whether it's not possible, I think it is possible. But then you've got to build it into the contract, but there may be a cost factor to that as well. Possible refinancing at the point in time, that may assist. So you're looking at a term of 5 to 7 years and look at the refinancing. But again, at that point in time, you want some certainty that there is a refinancing possibility. So whether it's a sponsor, whether it's, again, when I look at government, affordability is an issue. You look at Africa, affordability is an issue. So the idea is not to try and lock the government in for as long as possible. The idea is to try and give them a solution that they can afford. And affordability usually is a longer tenor. So absolutely, we will look at options. Banks do look at options. We look at different structures. The possibility is there. Whether or not it's feasible is the question we need to address at a point in time.
Yes, sorry, just to add to that, Shahid, I think I should clarify something. I mean, even today with a 25-year PWPA, there's always a chance that, or always the opportunity, as anyone has in a contract, to sit around the table and say, guys, there's a new technology here, let's have a sensible chat about what we can do. Nothing's stopping you. The only point I'm making is that to hardwire into a PWPA today, that when a new technology becomes available, you shall do it, and bind the banks to that commitment, bind the spots. I just can't see that happening, particularly when the banks are sitting there saying that might jeopardize my debt service.
If I may, I can add a few words. New technologies, we see that today in the water sector with RO technology displacing, the old thermal technology. We see that in the power sector with renewables, in particular solar in this region, displacing conventional power, gas power plants. And this is really a challenge, and we see that today. All the countries of the GCC have major program of developing renewables project, PV projects, and so we need to find a way, to manage this transition, and this is clearly a challenge. We have engaged as ENGIE and other developers in Abu Dhabi. We have engaged with EWEC, which is the off-taker, in discussions around this issue. This is a hot topic at the moment. Regarding your second point on the value chain and the distribution, collection, etc., you're right. My personal belief is that demand-side management is absolutely key. Cost-reflective tariff is also very important to manage the demand, and by a knocking effect, you have to dimension your infrastructure in a way to satisfy a reasonable demand, not something that is going to the roof, actually.
So just to speak from experience, we actually, we've developed two projects I mentioned earlier in '99, so they're 20 years old this year. And both of them, one desal, one wastewater, have gone through multiple technological changes over that period. Technology has obviously changed. We do have a clause in the contract, although as a lawyer you'd say it's not really a binding clause because it talks about best efforts to put in new technologies, but at least that does enable us to sit around with the stakeholders, with the bank, with the off-taker to figure out what is it that we can do, and more often than not, or pretty much every time, they're fully agreed and fully on board with what we're suggesting. And it's part of that relationship that one has. This is a marriage. You're in 25, 30 years together. You have to have that positive relationship with the stakeholders in order to make it all work.
This project will remain valid, in my opinion, forever, and it has not been replicated since. I'm very proud of this event. It took almost 12 years to get it off the ground, but finally we had a situation which I was hoping that it will take off, but from what I've seen, except what you've talked about, Rami, on the few examples you haven't, nobody else has taken it up. Thank you.
If you
Yeah. My name is Adil Bushnak. I like technical changes, but we need also social changes. So very, very important to add 1P in the public-private people partnership, because water-related issues should be localized by the people in order to have fairness and sustainability. So how the people can be involved in public-private partnership by first start with NGO and then build a public-owned company, locally owned. It's not coming from east or west, it's coming how you, over the 10, 20 years or 30 years of contract, you build that public-owned company in order to take over and keep the private-public partnership, so the private who invested will have the priority over other private. But really, we have to change socially, not just technically, or business, or economics. Because unless we go out of the present, basically either centralized, or now we're talking about privatized, but it is really still centralized. It's not public. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Yes, it should be 4 Ps instead of 3. I totally agree that the civil society's understanding is key to, for instance, I'm sorry, I have to talk about Japan, where the law has changed, finally, for privatization. They opened the door, but 99.99% of the Japanese citizens are against privatization. Why this is happening? there's a lack of understanding. I mean, it's not understanding. It's a lack of proper explanation to the citizens. So I hope this part is not publicized, but it is a problem that we are feeling strongly in Japan. I totally agree, and thank you for the comment.
I think
Shiba-san, can I just make a comment on the social part of it? So projects, and this is more in the energy space in South Africa, there is a big social element. One is during construction and development, but there's also now an equity, free carry equity play in the projects in a particular area. So we've already gone down that route where we bring in the local communities, and this is local community based, where they get a free carry as far as equity goes into the projects. In addition to that, it's a contribution from the project companies to the local environment. So whether it's clinics, some basic services, there's a compulsory element that's built into the program that requires a project company to actually contribute to the local economy. Thank you.
I think there is a question there.
Good morning. I'm Catherine from a South African bank. My colleague is actually Shahid, sitting on the podium. I've got two comments. The one relates to technology changes. I think I agree with the partner from Clifford Chance. The only thing is, obviously, if you have a concession that changes its technology halfway through, it's open to objection by other bidders. But I also believe that if you have better technology that's cheaper for government in terms of tariff, they will find a way to renegotiate and come back or do something to jeopardize the concession. The other comment I wanted to make, which I think it goes to that question of expanding the PPP model and how we can do that more effectively. I think I particularly like the way the Chinese construction companies have entered the African market. And the reason for that is they've probably wiped out our South African construction market completely on the continent. They go in with a funding package. So instead of winning a bid independently, just on their own as EPCs in a PPP, they go in with a complete funding package. And the benefit of that, besides winning the bid, is that they get to close much faster. The project gets on board much faster. And if I had to think of EPCs that I would partner on the continent and that we have partnered, I think the focus should be how do we go in as a team from day one. Still a competitive process in terms of choosing your funder, but going to government with a fully funded bid is much more efficient and gets water to the communities much faster.
Thank you. Any comment regarding that? Yes, on my opinion, and although you are right that there are successful experience on that type in Africa, we also know some experience that are not so good. And when you give to someone the confidence to invest, make their own EPC, perform the work, you are putting so much risk on one side that sometimes in critical things like the water, in some places the project never happened, the money never arrived, the project was incompleted. So at least in our opinion, it's good to have this, I don't know, it's PPP, but this public control of whatever is happening, to avoid the situations where people have been waiting for water years and years and it never happened. So probably it has to be a balance of the public and the people, not only the private side.
Just maybe a comment. I know the Chinese model, EPC plus government financing. There have been many countries in Africa, but also in Asia, who benefited from this. But the thing is that the Chinese money is not cheap at all. Not cheap at all. Yeah. It's quite expensive. Yeah. And you see countries like Pakistan, which is not in Africa, who got a lot of this money as part of the One Belt, One Road program. And now I think they are flipping back towards other type of investors, other types of development models. So again, here there's a balancing act, I believe. So.
Have we got time for one more question?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, Joachim Käufler from Synlift from Germany. We are working among others, in the mining sector, and we made the experience there that the reality is we're running our mining activities as long as the material price on the world market is like this. If it's lower then we close it. So, and this is really happening. And then we are asking them for financial securities over 20 years' time. They have no idea what will happen in 5 years' time. And this kind of thinking can be transferred, for instance, to nations. If it's in Africa or somewhere. If the climate change is bringing so dramatical changes, they will not know what they do in 10 or 20 years' time. So that's why I asking only, or maybe it's a discussion here or somewhere else. Should we not think in another way, not only financially, because this is not easy, on a technology side? If it's more volatile, the things, or more changing, then what about to transfer our desal technology more into mobile systems? Mobile systems we can do, for instance, floating systems, yeah, in a nearshore and offshore area. So it can be placed as long the activities are needed and can be taken away. And this might take away a little bit the pressure on the financial side as for guarantees and so on. So it's only a way of discussion.
It's a question for a banker.
I'm going to make a comment on the mining sector just in general. So I think a valid point in terms of looking at the water and how it's used in the mining space and the long-term effects, and the need for looking at it more closely in an earlier time. So there is a move in South Africa. So at the moment, all mining companies, I'm not a mining expert, so keep that in mind, are required to actually post a guarantee for rehabilitation guarantee post the mining period. There's a move to look at accessing that specifically on the water space. So a lot of the mines, depending on the coal mines, use a lot of water, a lot of, and there lies an opportunity to actually make sure that instead of just treating the water for the mine use, you look at the communities around there, those mines, and seeing whether or not you can offer treatment plants on a smaller scale, and whether or not that will start benefiting the communities immediately, with a longer-term view on sustainability. So I'm not exactly addressing your question, but there is that move, and there is that thinking in the mining community in South Africa. So there is a possibility that may pan out slightly differently, and maybe along the lines that you're thinking of in the moment.
I think we have run out of time, but any last-minute sentence or closing remark you want to send to the audience?
Closing remarks from my side, just on the African play. I encourage you to look at Africa, but more closely. Opportunities are there, but please keep in mind the model is different. You should be speaking to me, Nedbank. I'll take you through the process. But the opportunities, the demand is there, opportunities are there as well. And what we present as solutions are also different. So it takes a different approach, absolutely different, but whether it's to the technical side of it, the financing side, and the local community element as well. I like the point that Rami made earlier in terms of a phased approach that may be a better solution, given the initial costs of these projects are quite high. It goes back to my earlier point, you've got a dollar costing local revenue. You've got to see how we manage that, and as well as balancing the requirement to actually make sure that you supply water to all the communities. Again, Africa, the previous panel member made a comment around affordability, different government departments. It's not the same in Africa. It's about some countries' constitutional rights to make water available. You've got to have that balancing act as well. So in total, you have to have total thinking around how you're going to provide the solution to a particular country. But again, the opportunity is there. So I encourage you to start looking at more projects in Africa. Thank you.
Frederick?
Well, I think the IPP or IWPP model has been very successful in the GCC for almost 20 years. I don't see this changing in the future. Maybe we will migrating towards new technologies, but I see this has been successful and will remain so for the coming years. Maybe we can expand a little bit down the value chain, as a few people suggested, but I think an excellent model who prove its effectiveness, you know, and this region is now fully equipped with power, water infrastructure. And this is a great achievement, you know, if you compare to the situation 20 or 25 years back. And I see the role of the private sector, of course, very, very important in developing this project and this infrastructure for the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think just not wanting to repeat myself from earlier, but I think there are probably two other things that I see probably happening in the next 5 years. One is increasing number of privatizations of existing assets in the water sector. There's a lot of existing desalination plants out there. The governments want to get off the balance sheet and want to put into private sector operation because, frankly, the private sector, in the most part, is better equipped to operate those assets in a more efficient and compliant fashion. And the second one is an increasing pressure from procurers for investors to accept projects without government guarantees. I think the governments have now got to the point where they feel confident enough in what they're delivering to the market, the track record of these projects, and they're saying, look, we just want to push the risk onto you and keep our balance sheet off the project. Now, whether that gains any traction goes back to what we've said many times this morning, which is they've got to stop loading risk. And if they can get an acceptable risk allocation, I think you'll find that becoming an increasing feature of regional PPPs.
From my side, I just wanted to say that it's a very exciting time for PPPs across the different markets that we're in, and the additional opportunity of taking over existing assets is extremely important and exciting, and we look forward to further growth. Thank you very much.
Yes, from my side, to thank all of you and to thank the audience here. I heard promising, challenging, change. So at least we will have a future. We have some work to do in the future that it will be very good and very promising for all of us. Thank you, and I pass to Mr. Shiva.
Thank you. I would like to close the panel by thanking the audience for the thoughtful comments and questions, and also our panelists for sharing your insights, and also the IDA to give us this opportunity together. Thank you very much.